Hello, everybody, and welcome to this presentation on critical realism approach on autism. In this, I will briefly present the philosophy of critical realism and how it can help and strengthen autism philosophy and aid in autistic emancipation. But before we examine critical realism in particular, let's think really quickly about why is a philosophy of autism needed at all. So philosophy doesn't helps us examine the questions that we might ask and what this might mean for the answers we gather. It is not per se concerned with methodological rigor or what each discipline, what aspects of life each discipline may examine, but why certain questions work or why certain questions that don't work, and what do they mean for the data that is collected and how that data is interpreted. The alternative to a lack of philosophy, the alternative to not having a philosophy is not a lack of philosophy, but rather a bad philosophy. So even somebody who is unphilosophical will have a philosophy. It's just not going to be a very thorough and consistent one. Up until now, the two dominant philosophies in most sciences are positivism and interpretivism or social constructionism. So positivism, and they both have been criticized for conflating ontology with epistemology in their approach. Positivist approaches are criticized for overstating ontology, right? So the ontology being the study of being. So what they do is that they study the world, and they then go on to state that everything that they have studied is everything that there is to know about the thing that was studied. Therefore, their knowledge is 100% reflective of the world that they studied. Interpretivist and social constructionist approaches, on the other hand, are criticized for ignoring ontology altogether. So what they say is that our knowledge is all that matters, and even if there are things out there that we don't know, is our knowing of them that is important. Therefore, ontology doesn't really matter. It's our epistemology that matters. So what is critical realism? Critical realism is based on the work of Roy Bhaskar, and it aims to be a philosophical meta-theory that interprets findings in most scientific disciplines, but is primarily interested in those that bridge the nature-society divide and have material and discursive elements to them, such as psychology, medicine, sociology, economics, etc. And it consists of two main strands: transcendental realism, which is concerned more about the study of nature, and critical naturalism, which is concerned more with the study of social structures. So I will first focus on transcendental realism and explain some of its elements. And I will go through all of these one by one in a bit, and how they apply to the understanding of autistic embodiment. So objectivity. For critical realism, objectivity means a theory about an object, theory that is about an object, right? It doesn't, and that the object's existence is independent of our understanding of it, and it maintains its sovereignty regardless of our knowledge of it. So the object is whatever it is, and is intransitive, and the best that we can do is approach, and our knowledge of it is the endeavor of creating knowledge that approaches that intransitive object as closely as possible. So it's not, in fact, the lay, I guess, I suppose, or the most common use of the word objectivity, which is often used to mean infallibility and neutrality. And ontological realism is linked with epistemological relativism and judgmental rationality, which means that some things are really real, ontologically real, but our knowledge of them will always be relative, and the best we can do is make judgments about those things, and those judgments being and ending up being facts about those things. But just because they're facts doesn't mean they're all encompassing and neutral and infallible. Just the best approximation that we can do. And this type of objectivity can help us untie a lot of ontological and epistemological knots around the theories of autism. First of all, we do not need to know about autism or the set of phenomena that we have come to know as autism for the phenomena themselves to exist. The set of states and characteristics themselves are sovereign. They don't exist because of our descriptions of them. Our understanding of them does depend on those descriptions, however, and therefore so does our epistemology of autism. Furthermore, using the concept of objectivity as it's described in Transcendental Realism, one can make the argument that a judgment of the most common theories of autism is a fact about those theories, because to say that a theory may be ineffective or even harmful is a characteristic attributed to that theory, and it's characteristic regardless of who the attributor is. For example, to say that a weak theory of mind or a theory of autism dehumanizes autistic people would not merely be about the positionality of the author, according to a critical realism approach. Rather, it would be about the ontology of the object, the theory itself, which is what it is, independent of any judgment of any subject judging it. And this is important because, particularly in the context of autism and the processing and communication difficulties that co-occur, it is important to acknowledge that a theory or practice can be harmful to someone, even if that person themselves cannot describe, explain, or even understand why this is the case. Of course, it's not irrelevant to study why the theory is critiqued by autistic people specifically, and why for decades it was and still largely is not deemed as harmful by neurotypical researchers. It might be the case that these critiques come from autistic people because autistic people have access to deeper domains of autism knowledge, as I will explain in a bit. The second concept of critical realism is the concept of fallibility. Fallibility refers to the tendency of being wrong about things. So a judgment about an object is a fact about that object, but that does not make it neither neutral nor infallible. All knowledge, regardless of who produces it, is both non-neutral and inherently fallible, according to critical realism. And because this knowledge is fallible, all knowledge can be wrong or fall short of what it is describing. And that gives us grounds for criticizing any theory, which is significant in the case of autism, because then we can examine the current theories that exist out there and see why are they falling short of thoroughly explaining the existence of autistic people, and why certain autistic theories, like the theory of monotropism, for example, or the theory of the double empathy problem, have cover that existence a bit more thoroughly. The third tenet is transphenomenality, and transphenomenality refer to knowledge that consists of more than appearances, a knowledge that simply does not simply consist of how things look, but also of underlying structures that last longer than appearances and can make those appearances possible. So transphenomenality is an important tenet to consider when looking into the epistemology of autism and the agents of knowledge creation that surround it. Given that much of mainstream understanding of autism is a behaviorist one, that relies on phenomena, stating that something it is worth examining that what kind of understanding of autism that is. It is just the knowledge of phenomena, or is it, or can it include the knowledge of the underlying causes and conditions as well? Do the mainstream theories of autism entail the deep knowledge that has explanatory power over behavioral observations, or are they shallow realist observations that claim to explain more than they actually can? And the last tenet that goes hand to hand with this one is the counterphenomenality. And counterphenomenality suggests that knowledge about the deep structures of a theory may not just simply explain appearances, but also contradict them. So phenomena may not be what they appear. And it allows us to go beyond appearances rather than stay bound to them. And it is important for our liberation from appearances. And appearance being something different from essence is an essential presupposition of science, or else science itself would be redundant. And this is significant for the theory of autism, because it can be argued that the traditional theories of autism do not stand up to philosophic scrutiny, because while they may make certain claims about the underlying structures and mechanisms of autistic behaviors are, a weak theory of mind, difficulties to center coherence, extreme male brain, etc., they only deduce those mechanisms from behavioral, therefore phenomenal, observations. And your typical researcher or clinician, therefore, can only rely on their own assessments of autistic behaviors to draw conclusions about what autism is, thus making their knowledge about phenomena of autism not a knowledge of their underlying factors and mechanisms that cause the phenomena. It is therefore by default a shallow knowledge of autism. And shallow doesn't mean it's not methodologically rigorous. It just means, as we'll see now, that it doesn't reach all the realms of knowledge. And that is what a transcendental argument does. So transcendental arguments attempt to transcend the shallow reality of phenomena. And that according to critical realism, reality consists of three domains: the empirical, the actual, and the real, where the empirical, or experiences, is minor or equal to the actual, which are the events, which is minor or equal to the real, which are the mechanisms. So autistic people, non-autistic people, have access only to the realm of the empirical. So the experiences. Autistic people have access both to the realm of the empirical and the realm of the actual, because the events themselves, because the events are in our bodies, in our minds, in our lives. So when we talk about autism, we draw information from both of these sources, something that a non-autistic person by definition cannot do. Therefore, our knowledge is a more approximately closer interpretation of what is actually happening, and therefore building explanatory mechanisms of phenomena on autistic knowledge will inherently be more representative of what is going on. So transcendental arguments can have significant impact on how we view a critical realist philosophy of autism, because all neurotypical theories relies on the shallowness of the experience, whereas autistic theories rely on presenting the deeper realms of actual events, and therefore mechanisms that have explanatory power over what's happening, draw information from both of these sources. The other important tenet of critical realist philosophy is interdisciplinarity, which is the collaboration between different disciplines, stratification and emergence. So for critical realism, reality is stratified, and some strata are more fundamental than others. So physics, for example, can more or less explain most things, or be involved in most processes, but that doesn't mean that physics alone can sufficiently explain zoology, for example, or anything else about the human body. And the mechanisms of higher strata are not reducible to those of the lower strata, right? So So lower strata, such as physics, can have closed systems, experiments that you can produce a set of circumstances. Everything will act predictably. But for higher strata, that simply isn't possible because they're open systems, and therefore those practices will not be possible. And higher strata are more complex, consist of open systems where mechanisms from more than one stratum interact at any one time, right? So when we examine behavior, for example, there's sociological reasons, psychological reasons, sensory reasons, economic reasons, and so on and so forth, that something may be happening. And in order to understand them, therefore, we need information from more than one discipline. And also, we need to use methodological approaches that are suitable to that stratum. So things like randomized control trials, for example, which rely on the experimental nature of closed systems, is just simply will never be applicable as a method to higher strata that are open, and any factor can affect them. And now I will quickly talk about the second tenet of critical realism, which is critical naturalism, and use that to briefly talk about how it can explain autistic sociability. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the agency structure debate, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about explanation and emancipation. So autism, agency, and social structure. So one of the main debates in the social sciences is the agency structure debate. Are human social beings bound completely by structures, or do they have agency? And agency is what determines their actions. And humanism says that agency is everything, and society is a collection of actions that is enacted by its agents, where structuralism says the structure is everything, and individuals are bound by those structures and that act in ways that make all agency bound to its relevant structures. And critical naturalism focuses on the relationship between structure and agency and how the one influences the other. And autism can be seen in many ways as a forceful demonstration of agency, despite of how bound it may be by structures. Therefore, using a purely structuralist approach will miss that element of agency, but also using a purely humanist approach, we misses the element of structures. And of course, there's a plethora of structures that try to control and oppress and alter an autistic presentation. Therefore, my argument is that only by examining the relationship between agency and structure that we may be able to get a good representation and a good means to understand how autistic sociability manifests in society. And finally, I'm going to talk about explanation and emancipation and autistic participation in autism research. So in critical realism, there are the 6 levels of producing useful social theory. The first level is understanding that some belief that we hold about an intransitive object is false. So, for example, it is false to say that autistic people do not have empathy. The second level is to examine how a system of domination may be perpetuating that belief. So the fact that autistic people, for example, have not traditionally had control over what was said about them was the system of domination that created the belief that we do not have empathy. Then the third level is a negative evaluation of the false belief that accounts for the mismatch of the belief with the reality of what it is about. Therefore, not only do not autistic people not lack empathy, but actually what the problem is that autistic people may struggle to understand non-autistic people as much as non-autistic people may struggle to understand autistic people, aka the double empathy problem. And level 4 is positively evaluating actions that aim to disconnect the false belief from the object. So any research or practice that aims to account for that. And then level 5 is a concrete axiological judgment of level 4, so like an ethically informed judgment that is specific to the geohistorical context that the theory was created in. Therefore, we just because autistic people may be better at understanding each other doesn't mean that all autistic people will, because there are other factors in place like race, perhaps gender, perhaps ethnicity, national background, and so on and so forth. And finally, the action occurs. So that's the other important part about the critical naturalism, that the theorizing doesn't stop until theory is translated into practice. And therefore, that is when the theorizing ends, and then the loop, I suppose, starts again. So that is a very brief presentation of what critical realism theory is and how it can help autistic people. Thank you for listening. If you want to find me, here is how you can find me, and hope to hear from you soon. Bye.